And you're on.
Hello everyone, my name is David Beasley. I've had a lifetime of writing, and the Hearthside hearings has graciously consented to allow me to tell you about myself and my writing, actually, which is the more important. I divided this talk up into 10 different parts, and part 1 is going to be beginnings, bloody and political. Now, bloody doesn't necessarily refer to me, but it refers to a book I wrote a few years ago called From Bloody Beginnings, Richard Beasley's Upper Canada. And it's the history of Upper Canada, starting about the time of the American Revolution and carrying us right through to the end of Upper Canada's 1841. And the end of Richard Beasley too. He died in 1842. But his lifespan was very appropriate to telling the story, and I put it in his voice. He was the first settler in Hamilton, which was at that time in 1777 was called Burlington Heights, and some of you may know where Dundurn Castle is. It was built on top of his home, and Mr. McNabb, who built it, used his front door. Well, he was my great-great-great-grandfather. And so I'd like to speak about that book first of all. So we have Beginnings Political as well. And here is a painting. Now that's supposedly of Richard. And no one had any idea what he looked like. And this is in the Richard Beasley Primary School in Hamilton. And it hangs there. You see, all they knew about him was that he was a fur trader. And I must say that in local history in grade 6, I first heard the name and became very interested. And up until that time, I was a very poor student. I was more interested in play, but I became very interested in history, and by the time I reached grade 8, they were kind enough to give me the history award for the city when I graduated. So that shows what an inspiring name can do. Now, Richard Beasley's ancestry, here is a picture of Albany in 1750. His grandfather arrived there from where I don't know. I know that he was about 40 years before. He was born in London, England, and he must have had quite a career because he was quite well educated for those days, and he immediately started teaching, and he approached many of the slaves, the ones who were more interested in education, and asked them if they'd like to learn the catechism. In other words, would you like to learn to read and write? Which, of course, was taboo for anyone attempting that. They'd hang people who tried to teach the slaves. So they all came to his house every night, and especially on weekends, for years. And the reason we know this is because he wrote to the Society for Spreading the Gospel in London, and a couple of his letters survive. He'd asked for some money. I think they tried to send him £10, but the money didn't arrive because the ship couldn't get there the first year. He possibly did receive his £10. But at any rate, you can see that education was a part of Richard Beasley's background. And in growing up in Albany, the book, almost a quarter of the book, deals with the Revolution and the problems. So, of course, they were loyalists. But Richard Beasley's father, Henry, was a member of the Night Guard, and he was in the militia, and like many loyalists, they couldn't be outspoken. But his sister had married an Englishman who was quite prominent. He had built Cartwright's Inn, the most important inn there. He was a merchant. He was allied with Sir William Johnson, and he was an outspoken loyalist. And his son, Richard Cartwright Jr., has a great role to play. He was one of the first intellectuals in Canada, and he built up Kingston eventually. So there is what John Beasley arrived at, and here's a picture we finally have discovered of Richard Beasley. At least we think it is. He, this was sent to me from someone in Denver, Colorado, because it had been initialed CHB, and it was a charcoal drawing. CHB is Charlotte Hills Beasley. It was my great-grandmother. And I had put out a book of her watercolors, and this lady had seen some of them on the internet and said, oh, same CHB. And it was dated 60, so it's 1860, and I'd assumed that she had done that portrait. She might have known Richard Beasley, probably did when he was an old man. So that's why he's looking very old there. Any rate, that's ways. And there, of course, is Burlington Heights. Here, the early part of it. This is, there's Coote's Paradise in there, and it's very primitive. You see all the trees growing there. And he was below the heights, his first cabins and so forth. He was a fur trader. He was there, and he was also in Toronto from 1777 onwards. And he was pressed into service during the Revolutionary War as assistant commissary, acting commissary. He had to supply Fort Niagara with food. If the ships bringing the food in from Europe, for instance, were attacked by privateers, or the lakes and the rivers had frozen over in the wintertime, the people would have starved if it weren't for the large number of commissaries who had to trade with the Indians and bring food into them. So, and here's a later, around 1812, at the time of the war, and various aspects. They have his house named here. He was he had built about 1799 his house on the top of the escarpment there, and still had his houses below, down here, and the wharf and so forth. Coote's Paradise was named after a man who stayed in Richard Beasley's Inn, which was about here, and used to shoot the birds. So many wild birds. Beautiful. It was a paradise there, so that's why they called it Coote's Paradise. And actually, it was a name for Dundas until Hat Brothers came along and built their Dundas mills, and that's why Dundas has the name it has now. There is Fort Niagara. Now, this is a drawing by David H. Smith, who was a Speaker of the Assembly, and Richard Beasley succeeded him as Speaker. He, at this time, was in the English military, and he'd done this drawing. Now, you'll see all the houses here. You wouldn't see those today, because the water is much higher. But that is where the traders were. And Richard Beasley had joined with Cartwright in the merchant trade, and the Laurentian trade. And that's where he lived for a while, around 1780s, down in these cabins. Before, when he was a commissary, he lived across the way in shacks, where the commissary shacks were across the river. So that's what Fort Niagara, and there's Colonel John Butler. He was the superintendent of the Indians, and he had grown up in the Mohawk Valley and was very important in controlling the tribes, the Iroquois and the Mohawks. He spoke all their languages and knew their customs very intimately, and was trusted by Sir William Johnson, who was given the responsibility for all the northern territory of the Indians. And he developed Butler's Rangers. Now, you've heard of the Butler's Rangers making war out of Niagara. Well, so young Cartwright, the son of the innkeeper, who was such an intellectual, became his secretary. And they raided out of Niagara, and I talk about that in the book, and with the Indians. And young Cartwright was so disgusted by the type of warfare, the brutality of it all, that he soon gave up, and that's why he started in business and became very successful, along with this man who's called Robert Hamilton. You see, he's a very wise-looking fellow. He certainly knew how, he was from Scotland, he certainly knew how to develop his businesses. He married the eldest daughter of John Askin, the great fur trader in Detroit, and of course immediately had connections with Montreal and the merchants there and the trading business. And he was partnered with Cartwright, and then Richard Beasley and Peter Smith in what's now Port Hope were partnered with them, and they developed the whole region. But he had so much power. He was put on the executive, actually the legislative council, which when Governor Simcoe arrived, he set up the legislature. After 1791, when the Constitution for Upper Canada was approved, they developed the legislature, and there was the assembly, which men were voted to, and that's where Richard Beasley had a seat. And there was a legislative council, which was the people were appointed to, and then there was the executive council, much smaller, which was like a cabinet. And Cartwright and Hamilton refused to take seats on it because they would have had to agree with the governor, which they didn't want to so many times. Here are paintings. I don't know if you can see those, but Lady Simcoe is known for her diary, and she came to Burlington Heights to visit the Beasleys in 1796 with her husband, and she loved the Heights, and she started making a lot of sketches there. And these are the wash paintings. And this first one, you see, it's down by Burlington Bay, and Richard Beasley's houses by the bay there in 1796 are depicted. And this again is a view from down below the Heights, and these two are views from the Heights, looking out over Burlington Bay, across to the sandbar and the lake beyond. Here's a map. I don't know if you can see that too well. It doesn't come, does it turn up all right? This is of Burlington Heights. It was where he's marked where the settlers are. It's really Viscount Harding's map, which I found in his archives when I was doing some research. It's done before 1812, and he marks the settlers there, and you see a mark for Beasley and the Heights. And you notice that Burlington Bay is called Little Lake there. That was an old name for it. It was also called Macassa Lake and Geneva Lake, and it was Simcoe, when he arrived, who named it Burlington Lake after a place in England that kept that name. It was a difficult. That's the Niagara area, and I've given you that's where all the settlers' names are and so forth. It's quite gives you an idea of what it was like back then. Quite a distance between each settler's home, and then there are the boats that they used in those times. Richard Beasley had to take his goods by that type of boat. And he had to, at first, go all the way from where Hamilton is today, all the way up to Montreal. And that was quite a trip in those days. He had to go through the Lachine Rapids and so on, and those kind of boats. And he built a mill. He built a mill in the early days when it was Quebec, before it became Upper Canada. You had to get permission for mills, and that was very hard to get. So they were built clandestinely, but they had to have flour, and they had to have their boards made. And then in Ancaster, they built a big mill. Ancaster was the place that was developed mostly in those days. Hamilton was down in the valley, so it was rather treacherous to get down the hill to go there. So he built the mill in Ancaster, and now it's a restaurant if you ever go to the old mill. You can see how hard it was in those days. I missed that. Did I? Wait a minute. It was hard work. Oh, well, this is the coach. It was a losing proposition, the male coaches in those days. And this is the sort of entertainment they had, the dancing. And then this is the legislature, the early legislature, where Richard Beasley and Hamilton and so forth attended in York. This is the hard work I tried to talk about. There they are threshing, and there's the Methodist circuit rider. Why the Methodists became so popular is that there were a few churches, and the Anglicans tried to establish themselves as the primary religion, the sort of state religion. And Richard Beasley was in Parliament at the time, and he was Speaker, and he helped defeat the bill that would have accomplished that, even though he was Anglican, because he didn't believe that there should be a state religion, which he earned the ire of Reverend Strawn, which followed him through his life, made life difficult for him later on. And there are the bridges. There is what Richard tried to do. He brought settlers into Markham with Berksey and the German company. They were from Germans, from Hanover and so on, who tried to settle in the United States and found it very difficult. People tried to make them indentured servants. So they came up here and tried to get going in Markham. And he also brought people into Waterloo County. Joseph Brant had approached him. Joseph Brant, the Indian Iroquois chief, asked him to help bring settlers in. And they had great difficulty with the government because the Indian Department, the people like the Johnsons and the Clauses, who were originally from New York State, and were loyalists, but they wanted to take over as controlling the Indians, which their father had done. They wanted to keep all that land under their own control. They didn't want Brant to siphon off part of it. Brant said that because of the whites moving in, the animals were moving out, and they had to attempt some sort of means of the Indians having an income. So if they got money for that land, they could invest it in England and have annuities for the Indians. This is what William Claus resented, and he fought Brant on it, and he fought Richard Beasley, and Richard made him as a lifelong enemy. But Brant and Beasley continued to try to get this. What Beasley had done is he brought in Mennonite settlers who in 3,000-acre lots, and they had mortgaged that, and they were paying the mortgage on it. Now, the government suddenly said, oh no, you've got to mortgage all 96,000 acres. That would have been a tremendous sum, almost impossible to raise. But with the help of the Mennonites in Lancaster County in Pennsylvania, who all wanted to come up there, they did raise the money. And they did pay off the government, and Claus was asked to invest it in England. It must have been a sore point with him. But at any rate, there's Joseph Brant. There's a picture of him. He was quite a character, and he tried to look after the Six Nations, and he was involved in problems with Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr was Vice President of the United States, and he wanted to take over parts of Upper Canada, they sent in American settlers who would buy up the townships. And the idea was that when they got powerful enough, they'd declare that area independent and then join with the United States, as it happened some decades later in Texas. But the government, the Upper Canadian government, became wise to that and prevented it from happening. Brant was caught in between, so it makes for an interesting story. When Brant died, John Norton took over. There he is there. He's a wonderful character in Canadian history. His Indian name is Chief Tayunaka Warren. He was brought up in Scotland, but his father had been a Cherokee, and as a small boy, when the British destroyed his settlement, a colonel had picked him up as a small boy and took him back to Scotland and raised him. He married a Scottish woman, came out to Canada with the 65th Regiment, and deserted and went back to Cherokee country. And his son, John Norton, also left, and he wandered down the Great Lakes. Eventually, he was employed by John Askin, if you remember, the great fur trader in Detroit. And when he went to West Augusta, a territory between Ohio and Pennsylvania, he was known as the man from Augusta. And young John Richardson, who was being cared for by his grandparents at that time in Detroit, he was about 5 years old and going to school there, he saw this man, and he thought the word was Wakusta. And when he wrote his great novel about Pontiac's siege of Fort Detroit in 1763, his main protagonist, he modeled after John Norton, and that's how he came to be called Wakusta. Here was this Scottish, actually a Sir Roger Morton in the novel, who was known as dressed as an Indian and was almost a Superman in his dealings. So this became an international bestseller and put Richardson's name on the map. He was published in 1832. Then the next picture is of William Claus, and this is the man who made life difficult for Richard Beasley and others. And his sidekick was Titus Simons, and these people play a role in the book. It's not really a novel, by the way. It's real history. Everything in it happened. It's what you call creative nonfiction, and it took a lot of research. But Simons was put into Richard Beasley's regiment. He developed the militia in Niagara, and by the time the War of 1812 came along, he was the colonel of the 2nd York, and took part in a lot of the battles in the war. And this Simons came in as his major and made life rather difficult for him at times, working for the authorities. Here we have a picture of the War of 1812. There's a gauge house at Stony Creek, the Battle of Stony Creek. And these are the American forces who is the Battle of Lundy's Lane, and it was a sort of a stalemate, but it was fortunate that Richard Beasley and his son David were in this battle, and it was fortunate they managed to stop the Americans from invading. The idea that the Americans had at this point, and this was in 1813, and they'd suffered several defeats, they were planning as a final move to drive up from Fort Erie to Burlington Heights, and while MacArthur came over through the Thames River Valley and across the Grand River, and they would hit Burlington Heights, or the head of the lake, where there was quite a settlement now, in a pincer movement. But the Americans at Fort Erie decided they couldn't do it, so they went back across the lake. And by the time MacArthur got to the Grand River, he heard the bad news, and then he went south, burning the mills and so forth, on his way back to United States. There's a picture of the Battle of Stony Creek, which was a major turning point in the war, where about 700 British regulars and some militia and a few Indians defeated a much larger American force at night. They attacked at night. And there is again a picture of the heights and what it looked like with the military establishment. They built barracks, and Richard Beasley's house was taken over by the general, and he and his servants and his children, they had to go and find a room in the village head of the lake. That is difficult to see, so we'll go on to the next one. Here is Robert Gourley, who was the great reformer. The Niagara region was devastated in the War of 1812. The town of Newark was burnt, St. David's was burnt, the mills, everything was destroyed. MacArthur had destroyed a lot in the western part of the province. People were starving, and yet there was no help from the government. The government gave help to the eastern part of Ontario, but not this part, for some reason. And there was great resentment amongst the people. There was also, even during the war, a dissatisfaction, a disillusionment, which is an interesting aspect of the book. But Gourley came out for Scotland. He was a reformer, and he sent out a questionnaire to all of the settlers. He'd stirred them up, first of all, and the last question asked them, what do you think is the greatest impediment to development here? Well, it would certainly be the clergy reserves. They were wild lands kept preserved for the church to sell eventually. And the Reverend Strawn was the head of the Anglican Church in Upper Canada at that time, and he was holding on to these lands so they could rise in value. And he saw this questionnaire before it went out. And so he got the Governor General, who was his godson, and whom he taught. He was a very ambitious man, and this John Beverley Robinson was very far to the right. There is a picture of Strawn. He called Jock Strawn. Very ambitious man, and worked himself up into the Executive Council and the Legislative Council, and was at one point the primary advisor of the Lieutenant Governors. And there is John Beverley Robinson. He was a very clever lawyer, a very young man, but he really was merciless as a judge, and no matter how clever he was legally, he didn't seem to have a judgment about the changes in society that were taking place. For instance, the bloody assize in Ancaster was largely manipulated by him. And of course, the suppression of Gourley, by the way, they made life very difficult for Gourley, locked him up, and he went practically mad and then was banned from the province. And they went after Richard Beasley. They had a military trial where he wasn't allowed to bring witnesses, and his enemies were on the judging him, especially William Claus, and he couldn't speak in his own defense, so naturally he was convicted of all sorts of things. But being a colonel, he had called a court-martial on himself, and of course the court-martial cleared him of the charges. But still, the Lieutenant Governor, influenced by Strawn, took away his magistry, all the appointments he had and so forth, and called him disloyal. He was disloyal because he was elected chairman of an inquiry that was held in York from representatives all over the province, inquiry into what was going on in the province. And they had written a petition which the governor, the lieutenant governor, thought was sort of undermining the legitimate government of the province. We skipped a little bit here now. Richard has these wild lands he couldn't sell. He was trying to sell them because he had to mortgage them. And some years later, the people he mortgaged them to in Montreal went bankrupt. And he had a difficult time getting rid of them because at that time Strawn was forced to sell the clergy reserves. And he put them at the same price, but they gave people 10 years to pay. And Richard needed the money up front, so he lost all his lands. And his house was lot 18 on Burlington Heights, and he wanted to stay there. And the man who came to see him about it on behalf of the bankrupt firm in Montreal was John Solomon Cartwright on the left there. He was the son of his cousin, Richard Cartwright, with whom he had been very close when he was a youth. And Richard Cartwright had really developed Kingston and so forth. He was quite a prominent character. So he thought he could trust him. Well, John Cartwright said, yes, you can keep lot 18. I'm afraid you'll have to give up all the others, though. And by the way, those lands were worth about 2 or 3 times what they were when they were mortgaged, so Richard lost a lot. But immediately he ran into Hamilton, the head of the lake then, to see his friend and Tory compatriot in Parliament, Sir Allan MacNab. And he said, I'll sell you that lot 18 for £2,000. And finally, that's how the land came into MacNab's way. And MacNab built his house, his castle, Dundurn Castle, on top of Richard Beasley's home. Richard Beasley had to move into the city, well, it was a village ahead of the lake then. There are many vicissitudes he went through, but one of them was the cholera. A lot of Irish had come in with cholera, and they were trying to land at the various places from the Great Lakes, and they wouldn't let them land. When they came to what's the village of Hamilton now, it was named after George Hamilton, who was the son of Robert Hamilton, and Hamilton was one of the leaders of the city, along with Richard Beasley, and they said, well, we should allow them in. After all, you can't have them stay out in their ships on the lakes, and they're dying out there, and so the citizens finally agreed to let them take the barracks on Burlington Heights, the old barracks that the Army had back in the 1812 war. And this seemed to be a solution, except that the cholera did spread into the town because there had to be men sent out to bury the bodies, and they brought the cholera back into town. So for 2 or 3 years there, they had problems with cholera in the town. And that is more or less the end of the Upper Canada. Richard Beasley had, when he was in Parliament for the second time, worked with John Rolfe to bring in a lot of civil liberties and reinstate the so-called disloyal reformers who had been sort of their pensions of the war had been taken away from them. So he'd restored all that, and now it seemed to be that they were all loyal, and the governor, the lieutenant governor, went home, and he was somewhat disgraced. This is part 2. It's called the Canadian Don Quixote. The start of Canadian literature, and my own. Now,
are you stopping me?